Okay, today being the 7th of Teves, making it very close to the 10th of Teves, which of course is a fast day coming up. So we'll do a little learning about that. And we'll be able to see on the screen here some of the stuff we'll be looking at. Okay, so the 10th of Teves is the first of a series of fasts that mark the destruction of the temple, or temples plural. The four are the 10th of Teves, the 17th of Tammuz, the 9th of Av, and the 3rd of Tishrei. So that is the order in terms of the events as they unfolded. The 10th of Teves when the siege began, and then the 17th walls are breached, 9th the temple itself was destroyed. Of course, I'm giving the sequence of the first temple, which is when all these fasts started. And then the 3rd of the month of Tishrei, the fast of Gedaliah, which marks the death of Gedaliah, who was kind of last hope for the Jews to restore the glory of the first temple. Now, I'm emphasizing that this was the first temple because, as we'll see soon, once the temple is rebuilt, the second temple was rebuilt, the laws change a little bit, right? Because the fasts, the four fasts, are actually indicated in Scripture themselves, in the prophets describing those days, and they became fasts those years. But once the second temple was rebuilt, those fasts kind of fell to the wayside. In the words of the Mishnah, it's if one wanted to fast, they were able to fast, in the words of the Gemara. And then later, after the second temple was destroyed, it was reinstated on custom to kind of recommemorate the destruction of the first temple and the second temple. But essentially, the 10th of Teves begins this whole series of events with the siege of the first temple. Now we're looking at right here on the screen is the last law in the Rambam's work of Jewish law and the laws of fasts. Right? The Rambam, of course, wrote the famous 14-volume work on Jewish law, the most comprehensive Jewish law ever written, both before and after. And this is the laws of fasts, and he concludes with the following words. So I'm reading here in the Hebrew. You can look at the English. All of these fasts, referring to the four fasts mentioned above, will be nullified or abolished once Mashiach comes. Moreover, not only will they be abolished, they will be transformed into holidays, and days of rejoicing and happiness. As the verse reads, so says Lord of Hosts, the fourth fast, the 5th fast, the 7th fast, the and the 10th fast. Yehuda will be transformed for the house of Judah, to joy and gladness, and for good occasions, and peace and truth shall be loved. This is how he concludes the laws of Tainus. So just to explain what these four fasts are: the 4th fast, the 5th fast, the 7th fast, and the 10th fast. So the 4th fast refers to the fast that exists in the 4th month. The 4th month being, counting from Nisan, being the first month. So Nisan, Iyar, Sivan, Tammuz, the fast of the 4th fast, that would be the fast of the 17th of Tammuz. The 5th fast is the fast that exists in the 5th month. That would be the 9th of Av, right? 5 months from Nisan, Iyar, Sivan, Tammuz, Av. And then finally, so then the 7th fast is again the fast that exists in the 7th month. That would be Tishrei, the 3rd of Tishrei mentioned before, and then we have the 10th fast. That's the 10th of Teves. That's in the 10th month from counting from Nisan. So Rambam cites a verse which reads that then they'll be transformed into gladness and joy, which is why he concludes halachas by saying that when Mashiach comes, these days will be transformed into days of joy. Now let's look at the source of the Rambam. The Rambam, of course, is a codifier of Jewish law, and he doesn't, invent anything. Certainly, there are novelties in the way he understands things, but everything has its source in the classic texts, the texts from the Messianic era and the texts of the Gemara era. So this particular statement comes from the Tasefta. The Tasefta is Messianic age text that didn't make it into the last edition of the Mishnah or the final edition of the Mishnah. The Mishnah is a compilation of texts written over the period of the second temple period. And it was compiled after the second temple was destroyed by Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Rabbi Yehuda the prince, and many of the texts that existed at the time didn't make it to the final cut of the Mishnah, and those texts are compiled in either the Tasefta or the Braita. Now this is the Tasefta, so it's a Mishnaic age text, but didn't make it to the Mishnah. And again, it's the tractate Tainit, tractate of fasts, end of the third chapter, end of the tractate. And there it reads, you can follow along in the Hebrew. This website doesn't provide English translation, so I'll provide it. These days, referring again to these 4 fasts, will be joyous days for Israel. As the verse reads, and he quotes the same verse that Rambam did. This is what God says. The 4th fast, the 5th fast, the 7th fast, the 10th fast, against the fasts that appear in the 4th month, Tammuz, the 5th month Av, the 7th month Tishrei, and the 10th month Tevet. And all those who mourn for these days in this world, smechim ima, they will be rejoiced with them. Let them have in the world to come. The verse reads, Simchos Yerushalayim v'Giluba koleva, rejoice with Jerusalem, and all those who love it will rejoice with it. Okay, so this is the source of the Rabbi. Now let's look at some distinctions between the source text, the Tasefta, and the Rambam itself. So let's look at the opening words of the Tasefta here. These days will be days of holiday for Israel. Now go back to Rambam. All these fasts will be abolished during the Messianic days. Furthermore, they are returned into festive days. So there you see already one distinction. The Tasefta, the source, only reads just straight to the point. These days will become holidays. Whereas the Rambam divides it into 2. These fast days will be abolished. And now, not only that, furthermore, they will be transformed, they were turned into festive days. Distinction number 1, which of course raises the eyebrow. We need to examine that. The source, Tasefta, keeps it straight to the point. These days will become holidays, whereas the Rambam divides it into 2. First stating they're going to be abolished, and then stating they will be transformed. It's distinction number 1. Distinction number 2, at least for the purposes of our conversations, there are many more, but we're just pointing some of the big ones. Here, the text reads, these days will be holidays l'Yisrael, for the Jewish people. Whereas Rambam writes, does not mention the word for the Jewish people, it just says they'll be abolished, and then they'll be transformed. Now the verse he quotes is, the Lord of hosts has declared the fast of the 4th, the fast of the 5th, and the fast of the 7th, and the fast of the 10th. Again, these 4 months when fasts appear shall become occasions of joy and gladness and cheerful festivals for the house of Judah, as opposed to Israel. Whereas the Tasefta, the source, highlights it'll be transformed for good days for Israel. What's the difference between saying Israel or Judah? Well, because they're not exactly the same thing. Even though today we think of them as synonymous, Jew and Israel being the same, but not historically and not in halachic texts. And the reason is because, as you well know, towards the end of this first temple period, the Jews are split. Well, the Jews are split earlier than the end of the first temple period, but sometime during the first temple period, the Jews are split between the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. And the northern kingdom, the 10 tribes, are lost and banished by Sancherib. And the southern kingdom, Judah, goes to Babylonia, hence the name Jew. We are referred to as Jew because we're descendants of Judah, of the southern kingdom, which was exiled to Babylonia after the first temple, after the destruction of the first temple, and then returned to Israel. At least many of the Jews returned to Israel with Ezra to build the second temple, which is why this name Jew, Yehudi, only first appears in the Megillah. The Megillah, describing the story of Esther, which happens between the first and second temple period, while these Jews, these people who lived in the kingdom of Judah were banished into Babylonia, into Babel, which later became Persia, which is when the story of Purim happens. They were called Jews, whereas before then they were called Israelites. Before the split between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, they were called Israelites, because they all lived in one big country called Israel. But once it split, northern kingdom Israel, 10 tribes banished, southern kingdom Judah go into exile where the story of Purim happens, and then return to build the second temple period. They're Judah, they're Yehuda, they're referred to as Jews. And therefore, our question on the Rambam becomes even stronger. The source text says it'll be transformed for days of joy for Israel, implying all Israel, not just the southern kingdom Judah, but all of Israel. All of Israel will rejoice, including the lost 10 tribes. Whereas Rambam does not mention the word Israel, doesn't mention it's going to be rejoicing for Israel, just as it'll be abolished when Mashiach comes. Not only that, but they'll be transformed. And then he sticks with quoting the entirety of the verse, which explicitly states, Beis Yehuda, the house of Judah. Now, which leads to our final sort of problem with the Rambam, right? So problem number one is why the Rambam separates it into two phases, as opposed to the source text, which just gets straight to the point that the holidays, these fast days will be transformed to holidays. Rambam makes it in two stages. First, they're going to be abolished, and not only that, they'll also be transformed. Question one. Question two is, why does he omit any mention of Israel, that it'll be a joyous day for Israel, as the source text does, because considering the fact that all of Israel is more inclusive. It includes the northern 10 tribes that are lost. And point three, the verse quoted here, which as I just noted, says, Beis Yehuda, it'll be cheerful days and festivals for the house of Judah, is actually not a reference to the Messianic era. It's a reference to the second temple, when indeed it was joyous only for Judah. And here we can look at the original text of where this comes from. This comes from Zechariah. So we go up here. Oops. To get in there. Here we go. So you look at Zechariah, where the verse comes, where the source comes from. The verse comes from 8:19. Right, this is the verse we read. So said the Lord of hosts, the fast of the 4th month, the 17th of Tammuz, the fast of the 5th month, the 9th of Av, the fast of the 7th month, the 3rd of Tishrei, the fast of Gedaliah, the fast of the 10th month, the fast of the 10th of Teves, which we're going to observe soon, become occasions of joy and gladness, happy festivals for the house of Judah. But you must love honesty and integrity, right? Now we look at this commentary on the right side here. This commentary is from the Radak, classic commentary on Scripture, who reads here, will be, he's quoting on the verse which reads, they will be days of gladness for the house of Judah. So he says, all of these fasts had been kept for the house of Judah during the second temple period, because the 10 tribes had not returned. So it's referring to that period of time, not referring to the time of the Messianic era. Because then it's going to be transformed for everybody. Hold on a second. Here, the English translation is a little bit interesting. It's Kol Echad Mehem Lebeis Yehuda. These fasts had been transformed. The English makes it sound as if they were fasting during the second temple period. But he's saying here, on the contrary, Kol Echad Mehem Lebeis Yehuda, that during the time of the second temple period, I'm not sure who this translation is, but it doesn't seem to fit the Hebrew here. The Hebrew reads, Kol Echad Mehem Lebeis Yehuda. All these 4 fast days were transformed for the house of Judah. But by Yesheni, during the second temple period, right, they were mourning between the first and second temple for the loss of the first temple. And then when the second temple is rebuilt, they didn't mourn anymore. As we mentioned at the beginning, it was only one who wanted to mourn could mourn, and only after the destruction of the second temple was it reinstated as common practice. But during the second temple period, there's no reason to mourn. We have the temple built right here. Why would we be mourning some old time? So it was a kind of like redemptive state. But this was only redemptive for Beis Yehuda, for the house of Judah, because the 10 tribes did not return yet, and therefore was only rejoicing for them, which further compounds the question, why doesn't Rambam mention that it's going to be transformed for all of Israel, as his source text does, the Tasefta, where he takes this idea from, does read, there will be joyous days for Israel. And Rambam leaves that out, seeming to imply that it's not joyous for everybody, only for the house of Judah. especially considering that this verse is actually talking about a time when only Judah rejoiced, namely during the time of the Second Temple period, not in the Messianic era. Okay, so hope we're not too confused with all these little pieces of information, but just to recap very quickly what we're dealing with here. 3 problems, as it were, with the Rambam. Number 1, why Rambam divides it into 2 stages. First, they're going to be abolished, and then, furthermore, they're going to be transformed. When his source text, the Tasefta, just states clearly the main point is going to be transformed. Question 1. Question 2 is, why does the Rambam omit any mention of Israel, leaving it only with the verse that says house of Judah, whereas his source text, the Tasefta, does mention Israel? Number 3, the verse he's quoting, which explicitly states the house of Judah, as we just read, says the house of Judah because it's referring to a time when indeed only Judah rejoiced, during a time of the Second Temple when the 10 tribes were not there. When seemingly Rambam should be quoting a verse referencing the time of Messianic era when all Jews are going to be rejoicing, not just the house of Judah. Okay, hope that was somewhat clear. Now, because of some of these problems, the Torah, which is another halachic compiler, the Torah, written by Rabbi Yaakov ben Reb Asher. His father was a famous Rosh, Rabbeinu Asher, one of the 3 major codifiers of the early post-Talmudic era. The Rishonim, as they're known. The 3 being Rambam, Rif, Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi, and the Rosh, Rabbeinu Asher. So the Torah is the son of the Rosh, and he compiled the halacha for that era. Subsequently, there's been more compilations, the Shulchan Aruch and others, but this is one of them. And he writes as follows. Again, at the end of the laws of fasting. Oops. Okay. And in the future time, you can see where I'm pointing at the Hebrew. God will then transform these days into joy and gladness. Again, he is consistent with the original source text, the Tasefta, not making it into 2 stages like Rambam, abolish and then transform. We just get straight to the point, transform. The Ksiv, as the verse reads, I will transform their sorrow into joy, and I will console them, God says, and I will give them joy, from their oppression, and so shall it be speedily in our days. So you may have noted that what the Torah does is, first of all, he avoids the problem of 2 stages because he just makes the final point that they're going to be transformed as the original source does the Tasefta. And number 2, he doesn't quote this verse about the house of Judah. He quotes a different verse where God says, I'm going to transform your days of sorrow into joy. And this verse comes from Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 13. Then shall maidens dance gaily, young man and old alike. I will turn their mourning to joy. I will comfort them and cheer them in their grief. This verse is explicitly talking about the Messianic era. And here it says explicitly, transform them into joy. So the Torah avoids all these problems. He doesn't quote any verse that makes mention of house of Judah, which is talking about one specific time in history during the Second Temple period when the house of Judah rejoiced because they returned to Israel to build a temple, whereas the rest of the Jewish people, the 10 lost tribes, did not rejoice. He rather quotes a verse that's directly talking about the Messianic era when all people are going to rejoice because God's going to transform them into days of joy. So the Torah seems to be avoiding the issues that we have with the Rambam, making it further begging us to look deeply and further into Rambam's view as to why it is indeed that he is quoting a verse about Judah, which seems to be narrowed to one point in history when only Judah rejoiced. And our other question, why is he making it in 2 stages? First abolish and then transform. Why not get straight to the point that's going to be transformed? Okay, so that's as far as our texts go, and now we'll just share some of the explanation. We'll keep the Rambam open so we can look at it. Okay, so to understand this, the Rebbe suggests the following. There are 3 stages, explains the Rebbe, or 3 manners in which the fast days and the pain that comes along with it is transformed in the Messianic era. The first 2 stages are direct consequence one from the other, and the third is more miraculous. So stage number 1 is you abolish these days. They're no longer sad because we're in the Messianic era. So no reason to fast. At stage one, the actual observances of these days are abolished. Of course, the days in the calendar still exist. They're not abolishing any days, but we're abolishing the sorrow and fasting and pain associated with the day. It's gone. Mashiach's here. No reason for pain. No more fasting. Stage one. Now, in that stage, when you abolish days of sorrow, the natural consequence is that you're going to be happier on those days. Because imagine, this year, God willing, on the 10th of Teves, we're going to look at each other and look at the calendar and say, it's the 10th of Teves. Last year at this time we were fasting, and now here we are with Mashiach. So naturally, we're going to be more joyous. That's stage two. So stage one is that we just abolish the days of fasting. No more fast. Abolish the observances. Stage two is the natural consequences. We are going to be happier about it. Because look, this is a day we used to fast. Now we're not fasting anymore. This is fantastic. That's stage two, the natural consequence of stage one. Then there's stage three, in which not only do we forget about the pain of the past, and because we forgot about it, now we're rejoicing because yay, it's gone, but actually the pain of the past itself just transformed into joyous. The pain itself, the fasting itself, is not simply abolished, but actually transformed to be itself a source of joy. Not just joy because we're happy that now the fasting is gone. Last year we were fasting. This year we're not fasting. Yay for us. That's stage one and two. Stage three is the fasting and the pain associated with fasting itself becomes a source of joy. This is the ultimate miracle of the Messianic era. That not only is pain washed away because we are so overcome with joy, but all the pain itself somehow, retroactively, is transformed itself into a source of joy. The famous verse, we're going to thank God for the pain he put us through because the pain itself will be a source of joy. How? I have no idea, and I'm really looking forward to that day. But this is what God promises, this highest level of transformation, where it's not just that we're overcome with joy because the fasting is no longer, and because the pain is no longer, but the pain itself, the fasting itself, becomes a source of joy. These three stages exist in Teshuvah as well. Fasting and Teshuvah being closely associated with each other. And that certainly back in the world, first of all, we have Yom Kippur, in which we fast into Teshuvah, but back in the old day, when a person wanted to increase their teshuvah, they would fast. Today, the Alter Rebbe suggests better give tzedakah rather than fast, but it's a similar kind of idea. Fasting is you're giving up on a day of food, and tzedakah is you're giving up on your own money, all to increase your teshuvah. So fasting is associated with teshuvah, and really the reason why we fast on these days is to invoke some sort of teshuvah. We should reflect on why we're not eating and what's the history, and try to better ourselves. So in the same way, there's three levels of transformation in fasting. Abolish it, phase one, which leads to phase two. We're so happy now that it's gone, which leads to phase three, the miraculous transformation of the fast and the pain itself into joy. The same thing exists with teshuvah. The first thing is when a person does teshuvah, I am no longer the person who sinned. I've abolished sin. It's out of my life. It's gone. That's the first stage of teshuvah. The past is gone. Past is no longer. Which leads to stage two. Because the past is no longer, and I'm so excited by the fact that I've abandoned sin, naturally, I'm going to be more enthusiastic about doing more good things for Hashem. This is something that the Maharsha points out, the famous commentary on the Gemara. He makes this point that when we see this very often, that someone who's done teshuvah is much more enthusiastic about performing mitzvahs than one who didn't. And will go out of his way to do more mitzvahs than one who didn't do teshuvah. Because the person who never did teshuvah, the person who was always quote unquote observant, that person kind of just going along in a rote, doing what he did last year and keep on doing next year what he did the year before, and in 10 years from now doing the same thing, not looking to add anything. It's always there. But for someone who left sin behind and now does mitzvahs, the natural result is I'm doing more because I want to get as much as I can considering where I was. This is parallel to stage two in the transformation of fasting. Because I'm so happy that this day is no longer a fast, I'm much more happy. I'm so excited that it's gone that I'm more joyous than I would be ordinarily. Stage two, right? Stage one, sin is gone. As a result, stage two, I'm more enthusiastically engaged in doing good stuff because I'm so happy that I'm no longer in that state of sin. Like the fasting, The fasting is abolished, and as a result of that, I'm much happier. Thank God the fasting is gone. Thank God the pain is gone. Then comes stage 3. And this is something that was in this week's Tanya, right? We have a daily study of Tanya. And this week's daily study of Tanya, we studied chapter 8. And in it, the Alter Rebbe talks about a person who engaged in sin and how sin itself can be transformed into a positive, citing from the Gemara. The Gemara talks about how a sin can become a positive, and then the Alter Rebbe explains how. Tanya explains how. Namely, if a person's sin itself becomes the motivation for teshuvah, then the sin itself becomes a merit. How is that? What is love defined by? Tanya explains love as the feelings and desire to want to get closer, the feeling of attraction. I want to get closer. That's what love is. That's the sensation of love. I want to get closer to that person, to that thing. The more one feels distant, the greater the desire to get closer, right? We all experience this as children, or we watch our children experience it. They always love us, but when they go to camp, now they really love us, right? Because when they're home and they always feel the love of their parents. Okay, so it's there. They kind of take it for granted. But then when they're in camp, they're in sleepaway, now they're homesick, and they start to feel the love and desire to want to get close back home much more intensely. And the same thing is true, says the Alter Rebbe, of the one who does teshuvah. If a person does teshuvah, in stage 1, I'm abandoning my past. It's over. I'm done. I'm not that person anymore. Sin is gone. And indeed, I'm going to increase in my doing of good because I'm so happy that I'm no longer in that sinful state. But then there's a deeper level of teshuvah, in which a person looks at the past and says, look how far that made me be. And the more this person considers how distant sin made that person, the more enthusiastically is the desire to get closer. So now, the desire to get closer, the teshuvah, the love of God, is not just an abandonment of the past, but actually fueled by the past. The love itself is fueled by the past sin. Because the person considers and feels how deeply the sin hurt God, and how deeply that sin made him distant from God, that's how intensely he's going to feel the desire and love to get closer. And this is parallel to the third stage in the fast days. We're not just the fast days abandoned and therefore we're happy, but actually the pain of the fast itself is transformed into a joy. The sin of the past itself is transformed into a positive because the sin itself is the fuel for the positive desire and positive feelings of love for Hashem. With that in mind, we can understand why it is that this whole statement is even in Jewish law. Why is Jewish law talking about what God's going to do when Mashiach comes? Seemingly, that's a question for God's business. Jewish law is a question of, how do I behave? So why is Rambam and even Torah, we read earlier, talk about the transformations can happen when Mashiach comes, when seemingly nothing to do with Jewish law? Now we have the answer. Because fasting parallels teshuvah, and that's the point of the fast, to invoke teshuvah. So this statement about the transformation that's going to happen when Mashiach comes is an indication of what kind of teshuvah we should be doing. We should be doing the kind of teshuvah that actually transforms our past, much like the fast themselves will become transformed. Now, considering all this, let's look at the Rambam. Now he says like this. First, the fast, look at the English. All the fasts will be abolished during the Messianic days. That's stage 1. It's all gone. There's no more fast days. The natural consequence of that is, now we're happier because, we're so excited. The pain is gone. The fasting is gone. Stage 1 and 2. 2 being a natural consequence of 1, as we explained. Then comes stage 3. Furthermore, they will be turned into festive days of rejoicing and gladness. That's a whole other level. Now we're talking about the fasting themselves becoming transformed into joy, not just because they're gone, but because the fast itself is transformed. Now, the reason why Rambam splits this into 2 stages, as opposed to we saw in the Torah and the original source text, the Tasefta, which had it in 1 stage, just went straight to the point, it's going to be transformed, is because Rambam's view is, believe it or not, that there are 2 stages in the Messianic era. This is something that talks about elsewhere in great length, pointing to the Rambam's laws of Mashiach, the laws of the Messianic era, in which the Rebbe points out that in Rambam's view there are 2 stages. Stage 1 is when the world remains in a natural state. The world stays as is, no crazy miracles, nothing special, not even resurrection of the dead yet. And all we have is Jewish autonomy in the land of Israel, all Jews living peacefully and all Jews following Jewish law. The temple is here, and we live and serve God as we are meant to be. That's stage one, which looks kind of the way it did in the second temple period. Well, not all Jews are living then in Israel, but it's something like that, where you have a Jewish halachic, a Jewish Torah state, halachic state, which has a temple, it has a Jewish king from the line of David, and all Jews are following the ways of Hashem. That's stage one of the Messianic era, which is not anything miraculous. And that is what happens at that stage, is when we have the first stage. All these fasts will be abolished during the Messianic days. That's phase one. We're living in the Messianic era. We have a temple. We're serving God. No reason to fast. Just like many did not fast during the Second Temple period. Even though there were fasts to commemorate the first temple period, the first temple's destruction, which Jews observed for 70 years after the destruction of the first temple. But once the second temples were built, there was no reason to really fast. If one wanted to, one was able to, but there's no reason to really fast because the temple is here. Why are we mourning? Be happy. So the same thing happens in the first era of the Messianic era. We rebuild the temple. We have a king from the Scion of David. No reason to fast. And at that point, we're going to be very happy looking at the 10th of Teves and saying, oh, last year we fasted. Now we don't have to. Look how fantastic it is. The first two levels of transformation, the first two stages. But then there's a second era of the Messianic age. And during that second period, there will be miraculous changes. That's when the resurrection of the dead happens. That's when all the miracles of the Messianic era that we read about all happen in the second era of the Messianic time. And that is when the Rambam writes, furthermore, they will be turned into festivals, festive days and rejoicing and gladness. That's a miraculous experience. To abolish fasting because now we have a happy time, that's very natural. If we have a happy time, no reason to fast anymore. It's gone. It's over. But to transform the pain itself to be joy, that's a miraculous thing. And that only happens in phase two of the Messianic era, when there are indeed miracles. We're left still with our final question, which is, why does Rambam make specifically mention of festive days to the house of Judah, rather than all of Israel, as the Tasefta does, saying that's going to be joyous for all of Israel, as the Torah does, it's rejoicing for all of Israel, when seemingly we're talking about the Messianic era, which is going to incorporate not just the southern kingdom of the house of Judah, but also the northern kingdom, the 10 tribes of Israel as a whole. So why mention specifically Judah? And here, as we connect it to our parsha, of course, this week's parsha is the interaction between Judah and Joseph. Joseph representing Israel, the 10 tribes, Judah, the southern kingdom. Now, the Haftarah, which we read from the prophets, also talks about interaction between Joseph and Yehuda, Israel and Yehuda. But whereas in our parsha, Joseph is the ruler, Judah is the underdog, and Judah's got to approach Joseph, in the Messianic era, it's the reverse. Mashiach comes from David, which is from the house of Judah. So during exile times, Judah approaches Joseph. During Messianic times, Judah approaches Joseph approaches Judah, because Judah reigns supreme. Exile time, Joseph reigns supreme. Messianic time, Judah reigns supreme. Spiritually speaking, what this means is as follows. It is explained in various different Kabbalistic sources that Joseph represents spiritual thought, whereas Judah represents physical, godly behavior. So in the time of exile, nowadays, we don't see necessarily the spirituality of a physical mitzvah. It's a physical act. Where do we find spirituality? In thought, in ideas, in Torah study. We find spirituality in Joseph. So during the time of exile, Judah approaches Joseph because Joseph is a spiritual experience, and Judah, just the physical act, looks at Joseph and says, I wish I can feel like you do. But during the Messianic time, when we will experience the deep godliness that exists in the physical mitzvahs, then Judah is the higher one. Then Mashiach comes from Judah, because then we will experience the godliness that exists within the physical. And therefore, the true transformation of sorrow, of pain, of fasting into joy specifically happens with Judah. Because Joseph, or Israel, the spiritual experience, doesn't really go through any transformation. It was always spiritual. So even if we experience that spirituality, it doesn't transform us. It's us as physical beings trying to reach to some higher spiritual experience. Whereas the ultimate transformation, which comes from the bottom, it comes from the physical act, it comes from Judah. It comes from the pain itself, the physical doing of mitzvahs that sometimes are devoid of any sense of of feeling of spirituality. But those are the actions that transform. Those are the actions that truly bring about the Messianic era with the full godliness revealed from the physical, where Judah becomes the king, where the King David and his descendant Mashiach becomes the king. And then Joseph approaches Judah. Not as we have it in the Parsha, where Judah approaches Joseph. All to say in conclusion, the 10th of Teves, coming up in, when is it? Today is Tuesday, so Wednesday is the 8th, Thursday is the 9th, and 10th is Friday. Is that right? I think so. Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, yeah. It's Friday. The 10th of Teves, which begins the whole history of our exile, starting with the siege on Jerusalem in the first temple period. On that day, with the coming of Mashiach, hopefully very soon, is not only abolished, and therefore we're happy because it's over, but is transformed into day of into goodness. The pain itself is transformed into joy. And that parallels the way we do teshuvah, not just where we abandon sin, that's phase one, where we abandon our past, but actually harness our past to fuel a deeper sense of love and attraction and want and desire for God. The more we understand and the more we feel the pain of sin and the distance created by sin, the more we fuel our desire to want to get closer, the more we fuel the passion of our teshuvah. And that is represented specifically by Judah. Judah representing physical action from below to above, not some spiritual lofty experience that kind of is an escape from our physical reality, but actually the engagement and transformation of the physical itself represented by Yehuda. That is the ultimate revelation of the Messianic era, when all is transformed into good and positivity. May it happen speedily without delay. And thank you for listening, and thank you for the opportunity for sharing.